en estos temas, pues, bueno, imagino que estarán dispuestos a platicar con los interesados. Pero bueno, entonces sin mayores preámbulos, pues es una enorme placer que palabra, va a ser una plática de alrededor de 40 a 50 minutos y después vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa, como siempre, y regresamos para las segundas preguntas.
Muchísimas gracias por la presentación, Juan, y por su presencia hoy. Estoy, la verdad, muy emocionado de estar aquí con ustedes. Quería comenzar con unas palabras de agradecimiento. Desde hace varias semanas tengo el privilegio de estar en este magnífico instituto y me he sentido increíblemente bienvenido desde el primer momento. Estoy profundamente agradecido por su hospitalidad y deseo expresar un agradecimiento especial a Juan, quien hizo posible que yo esté aquí con beca del DA. También quiero pedirles una disculpa porque no voy a poder dar mi charla sobre el relativismo de la distancia en español. Y temo que aún no estoy preparado. Si desean hacerme una pregunta en español, por supuesto, no duden en hacerlo, pero los pido, por favor, que me tengan paciencia y me hablen despacio. Okay, and with that, I'm going to switch into English and speak about a manuscript I'm working on that is based on my thesis, which I've called Justice and the Relativism of Distance. And I would like to begin my talk with a passage from The Discovery and Conquest of Mexico, written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo in 1568. He served as a foot soldier under Ana Cortés during the Mexican campaign. It is a first-hand account that contains various depictions of the ritual practices of human sacrifices of the Aztecs and other indigenous groups, such as the Tlaxcalans, with whom the Spaniards allied, as they bitterly resented the Aztecs. In one passage, Diaz describes what he calls the House of Great Animals in Tenochtitlan, in which not only many idols of the Aztec gods, but also several ferocious animals were kept. Here's what he writes. I've heard it said that they feed them on the bodies of the Indians who have been sacrificed. It is in this way. You've already heard me say that when they sacrifice a wretched Indian, they saw open the chest with stone knives and hasten to tear out the pulp-pitting heart and blood and offer it to their idols, in whose name the sacrifice is made. Then they cut up the thighs, arms, and head, and eat the former at feasts and banquets, and the head they hang up on some beams, and the body of the man sacrificed is not eaten, but given to these fierce animals. It's quite evident what this passage is meant to convey, the horror the Spaniards felt when confronted with human sacrifice. It is quite remarkable how often Diaz refers to sacrifices to portray the indigenous people as being engaged in an evil practice that had to be put to an end by a coalition of the brave. But there are very good reasons to be extremely careful when it comes to trusting such a historical account and based on it, morally appraise what we now consider to be the cruelties of past societies. An obvious danger is that we can fail to understand why traditional cultures thought they were justified in doing what we now consider to be heinous. For instance, because scientific discoveries had not yet been made and forms of social organization appeared to be necessary. Furthermore, we should deeply distrust Diaz's account because it is what I would call a kind of moralism, by which I should mean the abuse of moral concepts to justify disgraceful acts of violence. I chose the example of Aztec practice of human sacrifice because it is a good entry point to what I want to speak to you about on a more abstract level, namely what the British philosopher Bernard Williams called the relativism of distance, which is, as he argued, an appropriate stance to adopt under certain circumstances. Essentially, It advises us to be hesitant to judge past forms of life in moral terms. And to avoid misunderstanding, I did not come here to defend human sacrifices. I want to illustrate, through engaging Williams's work, why political philosophy desperately needs to have a sense of the past. I think he helps us identify several moralistic mistakes. And the first one stems from what I shall call the problem of presentism. The assumption that what now makes sense to us should have made sense to people of archaic cultures, even though they operated with different conceptual frameworks and lacked access to certain facts. This can result in a misleading cognitivist picture of moral progress. The further moralistic error can come in three variations. First, a lack of epistemic humility can justify colonialist practices, that is, arrogant interferences without understanding. Often, as the pages of history amply teach us, meddling in the affairs of other civilizations in the name of morality led to much greater acts of barbarism than the ones the intruders were claiming to fight against. Second, a particular moralistic error can be committed by utopian political activists who intend to revive ideas of social organization that are dead and do no longer fit into modern societies. The third mistake I will emphasize lies at the heart of reactionary political movements that want to, as it were, turn back the clock and undo certain learning processes that we associate with what Williams called the growth of reflective consciousness. Yet I will, toward the end, argue that these variations of moralism should not only trouble us because they hinder social understanding. I also want to suggest that these moralisms matter since they have consequences that are reasonably rejectable from what is itself a moral point of view. This is ultimately an imminent critique of Williams's skepticism, in particular of his claim that there are no universalist conditions of legitimacy. Contrary to influential interpretations of his view, especially in the realist debates, I claim that he actually has a theory of justice and that truthfulness lies at its heart. In Uncertainty, Ludwig Wittgenstein briefly refers to Faust's famous statement that in the beginning was the deed. It appears in a context in which he criticizes the doctrine of rational intuitionism, according to which we can ascertain self-evident moral truths. I think this deeply inspired the non-foundationalist political thought of Williams, as he also referred to Goethe's drama in his late work on political realism. He spoke of Faust's axiom and called it the most important truth for political philosophy: the inextricable dependency between reflection and living. Claims to moral universality and objectivity impose a serious demand for an explanation on philosophical views, which cannot be met without cultural and historical material. In political philosophy, we must address a particular audience to justify normative principles. Williams was thus very much opposed to the attempt to see philosophical reflection as a kind of attempt to, and I quote, jump to the universalistic standpoint. Philosophical analysis, he held, will fail to discover truths that stand free of history and contingent practices, which is something we recognize when we think closely about what it is for reflection to get anywhere at all. Faust aimed for a unitary vision, an Archimedean point of eternity. Yet the task he had given himself was impossible to achieve. Hence his frustration about being no wiser than he was before, despite his prodigious studying. As we might say, he searched in vain for an absolute conception of the world that transcends, as Williams put it in his study of Descartes, the local interpretative predispositions of various cultural communities on Earth. In the realm of ethics, one can never be certain whether one has attained an absolute conception. What would count as a success? Williams thought that this is the real question skeptics should ask. And notice that this is not about the truth, the status of truth,
but about our capacity to know what is true. The crux is that all reflection about standards and values will be to persuade an audience to which all justification needs to be addressed, forced to draw on local conceptions of reasonableness. Faust's axiom opposes all philosophical attempts at constructing a systematic and external moral standpoint. Philosophers are no unencumbered intelligences able to withdraw into a study chamber to select basic principles that hold across time and space. In Williams's view, the assumption that one can be independent from the life and character of a society in search of a justification for moral views is an illusion that should no longer hold sway. On this basis, he criticized a radical detachment in thought from the bonds of a concrete form of life as the essence of what it means to do philosophy, in solitude and independent of given legitimacy beliefs. Such visions of politics commit a Faustian mistake, escaping into a realm purified of the specificities of political realities, history, and attitudes of those who participate in social practices. In my view, the most powerful contributions by Williams revolve around the problems of a reflective flight from the peculiarities of a particular political and cultural life. They address the standing of the philosopher and the claims her conclusions have on the attention of a particular audience. In his late work, he framed this embrace of contingency in virtue of the hermeneutical idea of making sense, urging us to analyze events, processes, and hierarchies in light of spatio-temporally located legitimation stories. On that view, what counts as an acceptable justification of coercion and hierarchies depends on historical and cultural conditions. Legitimacy is a scalar concept. No all-encompassing replies to what he called the basic legitimation demands can be given, by which he meant that those who claim political authority of course, need to offer some justification to those whose freedom will be constrained. This raises the crucial question, of course, who should be satisfied with responses to this remand? And Williams said that this depends on the historical circumstances, given that there are no, and I quote, absolute or universal conditions of legitimacy. So what needs to be interpreted is what effectively makes sense as legitimate. And this is why philosophical reflections must be in touch with what people actually believe and desire. This brings me to his internalism thesis. Williams' conception of internal reasons is essential to understanding his historicist perspective and also what I take to be his view of justice. So let me briefly lay it out. Internal reasons depend on the existence of an appropriate motive and can only be described by referring to particular persons. A has a reason to phi if and only if phi will satisfy some desire A has. Reasons are relative to what Williams calls the subjective motivational set, short S, of an agent. Deliberative reasoning that begins from MS will make someone discover what she has reason to omit or promote, and the reasons only have a motivating force because they're relative to S. Now, an instant worry one might have about this model is that it makes reasons too dependent on the S agents happen to have. That is, the internalist account might allow too much variability since it lacks, as it seems, a filter to discard certain desires. This concern can be raised, at least to some extent, with Hume himself, namely in light of the is-ought fallacy. Having a practical reason cannot merely depend on a descriptive statement about the desires we have, since ought cannot derive from is. To explain when a desire gives A a real reason to phi, Williams thus included the rich constraint of a sound deliberation. This leads to a much more ambitious version that goes beyond the crude sub-Humean model. A has a reason to phi if and only if phi will satisfy some desire as A has, given his or her S, that is the result of a sound reflective process. This ultimately means that Williams cannot merely mean contingent internal reasons, but those that persons, after a proper reflective process that begins from their S, would hold. This is crucial since it leaves open the possibilities that there can be universal reasons we share, since we would all discover them if we deliberated soundly. Put differently, there could be conclusions resulting from deliberations that all human agents would be motivated by. Notice that Williams left it quite indeterminate what a sound reflection would be like and which outcomes it could have. And as a prerequisite for my further discussion of his historicism, I simply want to stress that his internalism requirement does not necessarily preclude universality. It rather puts a demand of psychological explanation on moral theories and informs us about our motivational capacities. This is the key, I think, to understanding his relativism as distance and how it can leave some room to judge the past. After this groundwork, I now want to speak in greater detail about the aforementioned moralistic errors that philosophers and activists should avoid. They all result from being, in one way or another, oblivious to history. This is connected to what Williams considered the truth in relativism. The further we look back into the past and its forms of life, the less it will be appropriate to appraise or reenact them. The relativism of distance is part of his critique of the morality system and its rather self-righteous tendency, as he believed, to condemn others for their faults despite great cultural and historical distance. To adapt his well-known phrase, it is certainly possible to play Kant at the Templo Mayor of the Aztecs, but what would be the point of that? There are multiple reasons to avoid judging historically distant moral outlooks. This will often involve a lack of social understanding and be of no use. If one looks at people in abstraction from the social practices and bodies of belief in which they were immersed, one will not see them realistically. We now have a grasp of truths that destroy certain fantasies that were indeed the essence of pre-modern legitimation stories. Traditional societies often were not aware that alternatives to their organization were possible to achieve for them, since they thought that their form of life was necessary and certain events were inevitable. But for a change in attitudes to become possible, scientific and economic progress had to be made. And realizing this should, Williams stressed, spark a reluctance to treat modern outlooks we now tend to share, like liberalism, as a triumph of moral understanding. We fared better in seeing it as a result of a particular historical development, namely the growth of reflective consciousness associated with what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world. The magic has vanished from it, and the ideas that justify our social practices are thinner and more proceduralist, as this accords with what we now know to be true. Now, it is part of our ethical experience that some moral disagreements seem more troubling than others, and it is an important job of philosophy to make sense of this experience. Why do, to use a phrase from Nietzsche, the festivals of cruelty of the past disturb us less? To understand Williams's idea of a relativist suspension of judgment of bodies of belief, one must explain his distinction between notional and real confrontations. He writes, and I quote, "A real confrontation between two divergent outlooks occurs at a given time if there is a group of people for whom each of the outlooks is a real option. A notional confrontation, by contrast, occurs when some people know about two divergent outlooks, but at least one of those outlooks does not present a real option." When is an option real, then? Either when the specific outlook is already part of the system of beliefs and values of a group, or if its members could adopt it and live by it in their historical circumstances. This would make the language of appraisal appropriate. Otherwise, understanding should be prioritized at the expense of judgment. The key question is, would past people lose their hold of reality and engage in extensive self-deception if they were to choose to adopt a certain outlook? The point is one of over-demandingness, I believe. In the past, it was not possible to simply go over to a liberal perspective on the world. It would have been unintelligible. Furthermore, it seems obvious that in the present, many former outlooks that flourished in traditional societies are no longer real options, since the conditions of modernity would have to be removed. Trying to live like an Aztec warrior in Malinalco would be a rather ridiculous project. Seeing this helps us avoid a principal problem of presentism, namely the belief that what now makes sense should have made sense to people back in the day. This is a failure to understand the varied developments that were conducive to the emergence of new outlooks. It is misleading to portray them as if an argument about moral truth had been won. This cognitivist picture of moral changes leads to a Whiggish narrative of history, which portrays the present as a glorious triumph that overcame a benighted past. This would be a cultural, arrogant self-congratulation that exploits other societies as, and I quote Williams, sources of emblems and aspirations. Besides, such moralistic approaches to history, which betray an unwarranted sense of superiority, will have trouble explaining why these moral truths have been concealed for such a long time. Equally interesting is looking at the dangers of moralism in practical politics, grounded in a belief that one is in possession of the moral truth. This allows me to come back to the example of the Aztecs and human sacrifice mentioned at the beginning. In a critique of Williams, Hilary Putnam said that although we can understand how the sacrificial practice arose from scientifically false beliefs, we should still be able to call it wrong. Yet I think this misses the force of Williams's point, and it is no surprise that he himself called Putnam's criticism in a reply, and I quote, very ill-assorted lot. Williams is not a vulgar relativist in the sense that he thinks that, given that there was a pervasive belief in Aztec culture that sacrifices were necessary to please the gods, it was perfectly right and just. His point is rather a promotion of epistemic humility in political philosophy. We know now that past cultures were under the spell of illusions, but that should not lead us to the conclusion that we have arrived at a pure, universalist, moral point of view that can be applied to the past, as though liberalism were a timeless truth and should have been accepted by everybody. Instead, we ought to do a more careful job in trying to explain how an outlook has become ours, that our moral view depends on a contingent historical path. This can actually be quite liberating, as Williams himself emphasized, as this means that we, and I quote, cannot be forced by the world to accept one set of values rather than another. There's a great likelihood that contemporary societies are also in the grip of deceptive pictures of necessity. Future societies could well look back at us and say, how could they ever think they should organize human life in this way? The lack of humility that discredits human cultures for engaging in wrongfulness is problematic for a different reason too. I already referred to the moralistic justification of the conquest of Mexico. Diaz and Cortés leaned the blood and horror imagery to whitewash their actions. And by hastily accepting the view that human sacrifices of course had to end and passing judgment, we can miss the all-important fact that it is still very controversial whether the sacrifices and cannibalistic rituals actually took place on the scale the Spaniards reported. Some historians believe that they exaggerated the slaughtering of indigenous people on purpose to disguise their own cruelty. They certainly did not care about the deep cosmological and performative meaning of, say, auto-sacrifices, and that death was not perceived as something bad, but as transformative. In his dramatic tale, Diaz often describes Cortés, and this word is very well chosen, preaching to the natives about their holy Christian religion, that the Emperor Don Carlos had sent them to abolish sacrifices and robbery. This was, without a doubt, an instance of self-deception, if not an outright manipulative lie. The error I have in mind here is that our picture of the cruelties of the past might be somewhat biased, so that we fail to focus on the evils that were purposefully committed in the name of fighting evil. I will come back to this. Before, let me stress that progressive politics can also make moralistic mistakes, namely when it seeks to revive ideas that we can no longer live by. One can be seriously misled by applying ideals that stem from a different time than ours. Consider what Williams diagnosed as the illusion of Saint-Just, who drew upon the ancient conception of liberty, tied to an ideal of civic virtue realized through constant participation in public affairs to erect a republic de novo. Yet this interpretation of freedom was, as Williams argues, no real option for a modern industrial society, since, and I quote, the Jacobin policies aim to make French society into something that no modern society could be, and that inevitably led to human disaster. This argument clearly requires historical material. It was put forward before by Benjamin Constant in 1816 in his critique of the enthusiasm during the French Revolution for an ideal of uninterrupted engagement, the sacrifice of individual liberties for the sake of collective liberation. He described this as a political mistake that sprang from a lack of a sense of the otherness of past cultures in which these ideas were rooted. The ancient view of liberty was justified by conditions that no longer obtain, such as the small territories of states and hierarchies grounded in metaphysical views of the world. There was a greater ethical homogeneity. The idea of a representative system of democratic rule was absent, and most importantly, all republics had slaves. Their social organization made their members desire liberty that demands from individuals a subjection of their private lives to the collective. People held special ideas about the reproduction of life in the polis requires as a natural form of association in which some must serve, such as the helots, so others can become fully human within the realm of politics. The separation of private and public existence was unfamiliar to the ancients. According to Williams, the problem with Greek thought is that a bundle of ideas developed more than 2 millennia ago, and I quote, will be completely out of place in the modern world. All of this strikes me to be grounded in what one might call an irreversibility claim, according to which the historical developments associated with modernity cannot be taken back. Williams indeed said that it is impossible to remove the conditions of modern life. But he does not merely articulate a sociological thesis, I think. His irreversibility claim refers to an increase in intellectual insight, the realization that traditional arguments for social hierarchies and discriminatory practices were fueled by illusions. He also stresses a pluralism of conceptions of the good that leads to disagreements as a modern facticity we must face instead of moralistically wishing it away. The latter point dovetails with the final form of moralism I want to highlight today. It characterizes reactionary forms of politics that want to return to bygone hierarchical conditions. Such projects suffer from a romanticized picture of the past forms of life in which certain historical changes had not yet occurred. Yet certain conditions cannot be brought back, or at least not without paying a terrible price, because it would require silencing those who will ask questions that can now be raised. Williams tells us that there's no way back from reflectiveness without producing results that are either, and I quote, ludicrous on a small scale and hideous on a larger one. Scientific discoveries and the fact of human diversity are typically put into question by reactionary projects. They tend to defend what Williams called necessary identities, even if in a more attenuated form than in ancient Greece, and thus roll back greater democratic inclusion of various groups. Yet there are no such things as necessary identities. Nobody's born inferior and more suited for certain social positions. These are rationalized forms of discrimination that reactionaries wish to make great again, often fueled by religious dogmatism that feels threatened by social diversity. By not being willing to go with the times, reactionaries, blinded by their moralism, propose a simulacrum of solutions to current problems, such as climate change, globalized capitalism, and mass migration. Their nostalgia for the status quo ante stands in the way of learning processes because it is ultimately a failure to face reality. After now having described some of the strengths of what I consider to be Williams' anti-moralism, I would now, to end my talk, like to turn to a constructive critique. I basically assail his opposition to universalist moral norms and the common interpretation of political realists that the idea of justice is of secondary importance to him. Note that the criticism of these variations of moralism I've outlined above point to what I would call crypto-moral concerns. The Spaniards abused morality to justify cruelties. They claimed, in the words of Diaz, to have, and I quote, come to right wrongs and abolish tyranny, and yet they only brought diseases with them and slaughtered thousands of unarmed citizens, for instance, during the Cholula massacre in 1519. In retrospect, we find this legitimation story despicable because it was a case of moral hypocrisy. The abolition of sacrifices was a pretense to cloak a greed for gold and territory. This is what I would consider to be one of the worst kinds of moralisms, when moral norms are invoked to justify the unjustifiable. Morality can indeed be a powerful instrumentum regni, a tool to justify domination and oppression. Some of the most monstrous proceedings in the past involved the abuse of normative concepts. But if it is correct that moralism is best understood as a particular deformation, it means that we cannot comprehensively criticize this vice without employing moral standards ourselves. The critique of moralism needs a moral basis. This is also the case with the progressivists and reactionaries I spoke about. Their projects are rejected by Williams since they would involve hideous uses of power, such as deception and manipulation. And these examples, I think, point toward a thin moral universalism in his political thought, which is grounded in a distinctive idea of what we owe to each other from a human point of view, namely truthfulness. It is a neglected fact that he thought that questions of justice can transcend the relativism of distance. He did not actually believe that we are fully bound to a, and I quote, relativistic vow of silence about the past. Miranda Fricka accused him of introducing the concept of justice ad hoc. Yet it might, I think, be worth examining what he might have meant with it. In my view, there are two main sources of inspiration that define his view of justice. The first is the liberalism of fear, which puts cruelty first among the human vices. Williams considered it to be the most convincing justification of liberalism because it helps people avoid what is universally feared, such as humiliation and arbitrary exercises of power. It is a kind of view that, as he said, has a unique right to speak to humanity, since it represents a genuine kind of universalism that is related to a basic sense of being unfree. When what we do and think is directed by others, for instance, through the cultivation of fear. Williams took it to be a universal truth that might does not make right. Mere power cannot be a source of legitimacy. Authorities have to provide reasons why the exertion of power is not a mere form of terror, and these reasons can be evaluated. But this is a vague axiom. The wrong-making property of unmediated power remains somewhat obscure in his work. This deficiency can be remedied by asking how the morality of truthfulness is related to injustice, which leads us to the second source of inspiration, the Frankfurt School and what Williams called the critical theory principle. It runs the following, and I quote, "The acceptance of a justification does not count if the acceptance itself is produced by the coercive power that is supposedly being justified." This cannot simply be a descriptive fact about politics, given that it is an ubiquitous fact about this peculiar practice that it often produces the acceptance of its own justifications. This principle has been discussed at length in the literature. Yet curiously, it has been neglected that Williams mentions it in his earlier work, namely in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy already, where he states quite clearly that it is potentially based on an ethical argument that may help, and I quote, to keep questions of justice of past societies alive and make the relativism of distance seem less appropriate. Justice, for Williams, is primarily about truthful processes of justification. Its goal is to foster practices, institutions, and sensibilities that help us live within the truth. This is only possible when there's free inquiry, transparency, and trustful dialogues that start from fixed points about what we know to be true now and around here. Accordingly, a test of injustice asks how appearances of legitimacy and misguided sentiments are fabricated. An unjust exercise of power is to induce false beliefs and restrict the sphere of possibilities. Those who act unjustly often do so through lies and concealment that seemingly legitimate their actions or existing inequalities. They cloak the self-serving purposes of their actions and prevent truths from being spoken to power, which strikes me to be a basic enabling condition of cruelties. Why should we resent untruthfulness? Because we owe each other the truth and the effort of understanding. This requires seeing oneself and others and giving them the chance to form their own reaction to the facts. The unjust make trustful dialogues impossible. They coerce people against their will to secure what they want, speak insincerely, do not value accuracy, and refuse to listen to the articulation of reasons that might contradict their wishes. This situation is a paradigm of injustice, and it must be connected to William's internalism of reasons. For he must assume something like that human beings do share desires to make sense of the world and not be an instrument of another's will, and that these desires should be respected, which we can recognize after following a sound deliberative route. Let me end with what I began. These reflections, I think, put us in a firm position to appraise the Spanish conquest of Mexico as a paradigmatic case of injustice. The siege of Tenochtitlan, which was one of the most spectacular cities in the world back then, involved countless histrionic acts of violence. The Spaniards, together with the Tlaxcalans, killed combatants and non-combatants indiscriminately and cut off water and food supplies, which resulted in extreme starvation. The slaughtering of innocents was meant to demoralize the Aztec opposition and force them into laying down their weapons. Think of the massacre of unarmed warrior dances at a temple festival in 1520, described in the Florentine Codex like so. Then they struck the drummer's arms. They severed both his hands. Then they struck his neck. Then they all pierced the people with iron lances and struck them each with iron swords. Of some, they slashed open their backs, then their entrails gushed out. Of some, they cut their heads to pieces. They absolutely pulverized their heads. The Spanish colonialists wanted native peoples to adopt their parochial European outlook. When their attempts at persuasion failed and the Mexicans refused to submit, determined to fight at all costs, they wreaked havoc. This shows how insincere they were about having come to Mexico to end cruelty, even if they might have managed to convince themselves of this rather monstrous lie. Only their side of the truth mattered, and Cortés, the great manipulator, relied on strategic lies to divide indigenous polities. This dark phase of history illuminates something profound, I think, how cruelties are fueled by untruthfulness. The worst things we do to one another often result from our failure to respect the truth and be open to new experiences that might shatter our confidence in our outlook on the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
¿Quién tiene preguntas, comentarios? No quieres, estamos contigo, Rodrigo. Okay.
Well, first of all, thanks for the talk. That was very interesting. So I have a question about your interpretation of William's response to Putnam, because I was very surprised that you framed it in terms of epistemic humility, because Williams famously thought that there was no point in calling a moral view knowledge. So why did he think that there's no point about talking about our moral views in epistemic terms if he thought there was a point in talking in terms of epistemic humility?
Well, I'm not entirely sure I understand the worry you have. And you're right that he did not think that we can have knowledge about moral truth. How do you frame the question? Why do you think the response to Putnam is not?
He thought that there was no point when using epistemic language when discussing our moral views.
But that can't be true, because he did use that's kind of confusing to me, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But when he did speak of ethical knowledge, that can be lost, right? Because the circumstances changed, and the kind of ethical knowledge is just no longer was kind of shattered by disenchantment. Or so we can speak of ethical knowledge with regards to thick concepts, right? Like we can understand that Aztec warriors had a certain conception of honor, and they had knowledge about that, right? But at some point, this knowledge got lost, and then Williams has this somewhat confusing phrase that reflectiveness can destroy knowledge. Right? So he does think we can use knowledge with regards to ethical thick concepts. And my critique would then be, well, but you also seem to believe that there is some truth with regards to negative moral constraints, that we shouldn't be cruel, for example. Right? Cruelty is both a thick concept, but it implies, I would say, also a thin idea of what it means to disrespect someone. Right? So I would just then imminent to criticize them and say, you also need to assume that there can be some truth about what is morally universal, what is universal in the realm of morality as well. Right? So, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess it makes it confusing that there in ethics and analytic philosophy talks about like this fact that reflection destroys knowledge, because later on in his essay, What's the Point of Moral Knowledge, he said, no, there's no point about talking about moral knowledge. So
Yeah.
that is maybe like an inconsistency.
Yeah, I mean, my basic claim is basically that, to also go back to Faust, Faust says, there are two souls housed within my breast, and I think Williams suffers from a similar condition. On the one hand side, he wants to make himself a nuisance to all kinds of moral views, right? Not commit to any systematic view or basic principle. But then there are passages to be found in his work where he's clearly committed to a certain kind of moral truth. So my basic point is not to say Williams is right about everything, but to say that there's a productive tangent that is interesting that we should need to work out, instead of simply assuming that he did not think there are universal conditions of legitimacy. I just don't think that makes sense. It's just inconsistent with much of what he says, because he does use the language of injustice, he does use the language of cruelty, and he doesn't use it in a way where he says, that is relativist. Especially with regards to relativism of fear. Relativism of fear is not a relativist doctrine of morality. The problem with the relativism of fear is much more
liberalism.
What did I say?
Relativism.
Sorry, oh my god. No, I meant relativism of fear. Okay, new mention. The liberalism of fear, right, is clearly grounded in the basic moral principle that liberals of fear have to consider to be true. Right? And he did endorse the liberalism of fear. So how does that work together with your skepticism about universal reasons? Right. So this is basically what my paper is about. So I'm not saying this is the true Williams. At some point, of course, it becomes like my view, right? Because this is what I find interesting when it comes to moral universality.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Oh.
Yeah, well, thank you. As I already told you, I sympathize with your exegesis of Williams. However, I have some doubts regarding the idea of Williams having a theory of justice, or at least labeling as a theory of justice. Because I think that in order to have a theory of justice, what your theory has to, the kind of truth that your theory has to track is a moral truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that both the liberalism of fear and also the critical theory principle track a different kind of truth,
Okay.
which has to do with some sort of very basic sense of freedom and not being powerlessness, etc. And the critical theory test actually, the kind of truth that tracks is that we are not being deceived by the authority. That is, that we follow the orders of the authority not because of its coercive power, but rather because there are some normative or at least evaluative conditions that are satisfied by the authority.
Mm-hmm.
So I would rather say that Williams has something that resembles a theory of injustice, in the sense that it allows us to identify some unjust situations, but to have a theory of justice requires more than that.
Okay,
Requires like moral truth, some kind of moral truth. So, I mean, I don't know if I disagree with Williams having with claiming that Williams has a theory of justice, or either I disagree with labeling Williams is same as a theory of justice. I don't know which of these two possibilities I disagree with, because I don't understand exactly which one are you committed to.
Right.
But yeah, I guess I don't know if it's more or less clear where my
No, it's clear. Yeah, it's very, very helpful. Thank you. So, I mean, the easy response is to say that in Truth and Truthfulness, right, in the 9th chapter where he introduces the critical theory test, he himself says it's a test of injustice, right? And he also says it in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. But of course, maybe one could agree, yes, he has a theory of injustice, right? That is moral in a certain sense, but that does not mean that he also has a theory of justice. Because, and that is something we actually also learned from Sheklar. In The Faces of Injustice, Sheklar very much positions herself against what she calls the normal model of justice, right? That thinks, falsely, that we first need to figure out what justice is in perfection. We need to have an idea of a perfect and just society, right? An ideal. And then we also know what injustice means, right? But Sheklar was all about saying injustice in itself is more distinctive, right? And we should not treat injustice as just the opposite of justice, but as something distinctive that we need to understand, for instance, by really taking into consideration, this makes it also an epistemic point, the point of view of victims of injustice, right? To really experience it, to understand what's the nuances. So I guess Williams was also very much convinced by that. But then he does also mention the concept of justice in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, right? Explicitly. And then also calls it in Truth and Truthfulness, his last book, and the one that realists often refer to. He calls it a moral concept that is basically about the rightful exercise of power. So it is then connected to the critical theory test, because the critical theory test is about an unjust, unrightful exercise of power, namely as a form of deception, manipulation, making you believe that the system is just, although I only want you to believe this because it's in my interest. Right? But you're right that these remarks about injustice do not immediately mean that there's also a more comprehensive theory of justice that is, for instance, grounded in a certain anthropological picture of basic human interests and desires. That's basically what I tried out. You know, doesn't he need to, if he has a theory of justice, doesn't he need to be given this internalism of reasons? Wouldn't he be forced to base it on a certain picture of what it means to be human, right? That we can all kind of recognize. And one thing he thought, citing Aristotle and of course his metaphysics, his first sentence, that what it means to be human means to desire to know. Being human entails a longing to know. That is often frustrated by unjust circumstances, this desire to know. It's either manipulated by fascists, of course, who give us a wrongful sense of what is true by conspiracy theories. Right? And then justice might be, as I think, about creating the conditions in which we can live in the truth. And Williams said also, and I think he has this phrase from Václav Havel, who talks a lot about the problem of untruthfulness, right, and the power of powerlessness. So he also says that it's important to live within the truth. And Williams says that's a value in itself. Living in the truth is just a better way to be. You know, I think this must be in some way connected to what is his more or less implicit idea of justice, I think. Right. And I could say more about this, but I will shut up. Thank you very much for your questions. It's very helpful.
Thank you. My question has to do with how strong do you think is the link between Williams's internalism of reasons and his ideas on justice? You can say something a little bit more about that, because I didn't see it that.
Yeah.
I mean, internalism of reasons is a position on reasons and motivation and morality in general, and these views on justice might, for example, could they be held by externalist reasons? I don't see a problem with that, for example.
Yeah. Well, that's the part where I'm most confused about, and I'm not an ethicist, so maybe it's also difficult for me to really grasp the difference between external and internal reasons. But I do believe that this is a fundamental basic premise of Williams's whole edifice, right? That needs to be connected to reasons of justice, right? Because he needs to make an argument that an argument of justice, a view of justice is connected to the internal reasons we have, right? And he,
But all these ideas of justice as truthful process of justification,
yeah,
that sounds something that you can accept if you believe, if you hold an externalist view of reasons. You think that reasons are that there are reasons are there, they don't depend on your motivational set. And so that discussion to me has to do more with the Humean theory of motivation.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly connected to Williams's problems Williams sees with basing ideas of justice and moral demands of perspective to each other on transcendental notions of freedom, right? For instance, in Kant's case, and pictures of dignity that are not grounded in empirical capacities and motivation capacities at all, but are grounded in the idea of freedom and a normal. Williams was very much opposed to that picture because he was to that extent an anti-Kantian. That doesn't mean he rejects Kant's ideas when he says like we share a desire not to be an instrument of another's will. He seems to be very much in accord with the forbiddance of instrumentalization, right? But he just wants to give it a different, more empirical basis, right? So the divide between Kantian ideas and Williams is maybe not that large. He just thought we need a different idea of what it means to respect humanity that is grounded in empirical facts about it. He speaks, for instance, in the Ethics of the Limits of Philosophy, of a historical conception of humanity and a kind of convergence that would grow from inside human life, and this is what we would have to understand. So, in that sense, he's opposed to an externalist moral viewpoint, and I think he's also very much influenced by Necki's argument from Prince. I think his external reasons are just be an odd thing if they are too completely detached from what it means to be human. So Williams tries to make sense of the human condition, right? And he's opposed to moral views that just abstract from all that and think they don't need it. Right? Because that's always misleading.
just one minor point again.
Yeah.
You said that unjust exercise of power is to infuse false belief. So when you talk about justice in Williams, it's pretty much about beliefs, true beliefs and false beliefs, and the internalist view on reason has to do with desires and whether something can be a reason without being motivating to do because being part of your desires. So I think something there can be, like, I don't know, to make more stronger the claim that the internalism of reasons has to do with what Williams later said about justice.
I need to make it stronger. I guess I didn't make it so strong yet because I'm not entirely sure yet how to tie up the knots. Right, but I yesterday very quickly reread this really great appendix paper by Scandon on internal and external reasons, where he also ends with the conclusion that the divide is maybe actually not that big, right? And that there's much in Williams that seems to allow us to say that he does have a strong normative thesis about the reasons we all share, because he does reject cruelty, for instance. And much of it depends, of course, on how you flesh out the sound deliberative route. What is meant by this reflective process that Williams has in mind? And does that, in the end, really mean that someone can have a reason even though he's currently not motivated by it or doesn't have a desire yet? Williams, I think, wants to say yes, because he's very worried about the relativist charge. Because believing doesn't make it so, desiring doesn't make it so, we need to filter. And the sound deliberative route, I do believe, brings Williams into the very tension that I'm interested in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So perhaps I'm going to oversimplify what you said, or even misunderstand it. So maybe take my question as clarificatory. I see a certain tension between your way out of naive realism, right, which has to do with epistemic justice. For instance, in the case of sacrifice, right, the criticism by the colonial Spaniards was not fair because it was used to justify colonial evils, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, on one hand. On the other hand, we have the issue of internal reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, they seem like to me a little bit orthogonal, right? But I think I'm going back to my Moist question. If you're gonna judge the morality of an action just based on the form of life, on internal reasons, etc. The solution is not one that gets us directly to external reasons either, right? That you suggest. So, for instance, you could say, well, the internal reasons of the Spaniards, would they justify, or based on what do we decide that it's unfair or unjust, the criticism of a certain form of life or practice, such as human sacrifices? So that's my question. I see a certain potential tension there between the internal reasons aspect, that we don't want to fall into a naive relativism, but how do we actually get out of it?
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure whether I have a very convincing answer, but of course my point here was that when we look back at this passage of history and its cruelty and its problems that were present, that we want to criticize, we have this desire to say, yeah, that was definitely wrong on many fronts, right? And how can we do this? And I want to say, it's not so easy, or maybe just this quick jump to the universalistic standpoint to say, yeah, just sacrifices were of course wrong, right? Because the Aztec, at least one could say, they were not deceiving each other, right? I want to say that they were actually truthful with regards to what they could know, right? So we need to understand why they thought that their way of life was the way to go on, was justified, was necessary, right? And then we should be more careful with saying, yeah, they were just evil, but because they weren't, because they really genuinely thought that this was a necessary social organization, this had to be done because they believed in gods.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that human sacrifices are not wrong. The moment we discover that the belief in sacrifices is based on an illusion of something that's just not true. So the practice becomes particularly unjust the moment when there is knowledge emerging and it is being suppressed, right? Because the sacrifices, for example, are not only based on belief, but also are a form of suppression of other indigenous groups, right? The Aztec Empire was an empire, right? So there's also, of course, the instrumentalization of sacrifices as a cruel method, right? So that's what we then need to think about, and then it gets really interesting, right? So when did this knowledge then emerge that made the sacrifices kind of be questionable, right? And how were then people treated that said, I don't believe this anymore because we now know this, right? What's being done to these people? Right? That's the question one should ask from William's perspective, and then injustice becomes really relevant. When it comes to the Spaniards, I think the case is just the injustice is just clearer, right? Because they were deliberately deceiving, right, and were not at all open to understanding, right, and had a failure to understand the sense of otherness, right? That's, for instance, all the cruelties that happened during the siege of Tenochtitlan were related to Cortés simply not understanding why the Mexicans would not give up. He thought he could just use European methods of warfare, and that would lead to them giving up, but they didn't, and he just failed to understand why, and that led to horrendous slaughter. Right? So it was, and that is, in my view, also a failure of being truthful, right? Because they came to Mexico with their view that their God is the right one, right? And you have to think about, I don't know, during the 16th century, there were also, of course, the witch hunts, right? So I don't know, saying that you represent a kind of religion that doesn't allow cruelties was just a pretense. And I think we need to be able to criticize the kinds of manipulation that Cortés was engaged in. And it's really fascinating to read the book by the ideas with that question in mind. And it's really fascinating to read Cortés's letters. He was indeed a great manipulator, right? And that is always unjust. Right? That's what we can say with William. In that sense, I can show basically how he could have meant it that the relativism of distance can be transcended by certain questions of justice. That was my kind of idea. Like, I'm not an expert in the history of Mesoamerican societies and all this, but I felt it worked quite okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm confused about how you're using the criterion of truthfulness. But before that, I just want to say about internalism. I'm also confused about the way in which internalism is being discussed here. Internalism does not necessarily deal with relativism.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
that's clear,
Yeah.
I suppose, in
Yeah.
this discussion. So
Yes.
people think that if you want to avoid relativism, then you need some external criteria. But that's not correct. I mean, the great internalists like Hume or Kant on some interpretations were also universalists.
Yeah.
I mean, if Kant is too controversial, then take Hume. I mean, he was universalist
Yeah.
and thoroughgoing internalist. So it's not, so internalism doesn't imply relativism at all.
Yeah.
But my question was about truthfulness.
Yeah.
And I'm very struck by the way you're using it, where the Aztecs apparently were truthful and the Spaniards were not. I mean,
Yeah.
why are you so sure about that?
Right. Right.
I mean, of course, I mean, the Aztecs had their own hierarchical organization. Of course, there was a lot of cruelty, oppression,
Yeah.
and I'm sure a lot of manipulation and deception
Yeah.
going on there. And then why assume that because they were defeated? And also the Spaniards, Cortés was, a great manipulator, but why think that like all the Spaniards came to Mexico?
No, sure.
Just because they were told, some of them,
Yeah.
take the monks, because they were fully convinced that their own God was the true one. Why? Because you implied that in what you said, that made it less truthful. Because you said, that they believed, like Bernal thought that his own God was the true one. That made him less truthful. So I don't understand how you're applying, in this particular case. And also, that's a particular question, but that takes me to my original question, which is also about truthfulness. And in your conclusion, I don't remember correctly, but you're saying something about justice, equating justice with truthfulness. And I think you said justice as a moral concept, as opposed to what? Epistemic? So moral not as opposed to political, as opposed to epistemic. I didn't understand how you were saying it, but that seems to me that could be perhaps a moralistic error, because, this idea of justice as complete truthfulness, transparency. So there's been no justice in the world ever, and there will never be. No, really, and that's much worse even than the kingdom of heavens. No, it's such a high blown, out of this world, impossible for human beings. Has nothing to do with politics. That's why I was asking you, moral in what sense? Because has nothing to do with politics to begin with, because politics is always about the exercise of power, always. It's always about the exercise of power. It can be guided by moral principles and all that stuff, that's okay. But it's always about the exercise of power. There are always people who win, people who lose, and so I don't see how this criterion, how this way of understanding justice as complete truthfulness and transparency, blah, 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 has anything to do with politics first, with the exercise of power, even with the legitimate exercise of power. So it seems to be another kind of moralistic error. To use that kind of out of this world standards that we cannot, but just continually fail to live up, and they may not even give us guidance. They may not have any practical bite, because politics cannot possibly be like that. It seems to me, maybe I'm just wrong, but.
Maybe I'm gonna ask something very similar.
Okay.
So maybe I'll just say very quickly now, but just to motivate. My reaction was, well, so we have this lack of epistemic humility as a mistake, as a form of moralism, moral mistake. But then it seems like the lack of epistemic humility just made its way to, and then when you say that deception, deliberate deception is the basis of justice, then maybe that's a lack of epistemic humility, because how do we know whether they were lying or they were deceiving us. So you went from the more moral mistake to being an epistemic mistake in the sense not because there is a point, especially because on some accounts of the conquest, it's actually so it's not really the Spaniards who conquered Tenochtitlan. It was like everybody else and everyone and the Spaniards against the Aztecs, right? So and because the Aztec I was this real oppressive nasty regime. But the point is that, so how do we know there's an epistemic barrier when it comes to understanding the motivations and the actors, and so that can also then, so in other words, the grounding justice in deception and identifying deception is going to be very tricky, and also perhaps a very fragile basis for justice. But it's
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have to concede that the saying that the Spanish were untruthful and the Aztecs were not would be way too inaccurate and misleading, would possibly a distortion, because obviously there's also a bunch of deception and untruthfulness going on all sides. Right? So I of course have to concede this, and you're right. It's also the wrong picture to say like it was just the Spaniards, because there were only 800 of them at the end, right? That committed these cruelties, but of course they colluded with many other groups who committed these cruelties. Right? I maybe should not say something like justice is only about truthfulness. And truthfulness is one, I think, universal criteria that Williams has, that he uses to judge beliefs and certain political practices as unjust, right? But this does not necessarily have to mean that he thinks a completely just society would be completely transparent and truthful, right? But then justice is a standard that helps us evaluate, right? It doesn't, justice could just be something infeasible, right? I'm very much on the side of Cohn in that respect. Even though it is really idealistic to demand truthfulness of politics, given how politics is, we can still criticize politicians for being deliberately untruthful and call that unjust. And I do think that is a universal criteria that Williams at the end has. And it's at least to me an interesting question how we can make political deliberation and structures of justification more truthful. That can lead to interesting questions also of political design that are feasible. Right? Where we, for instance, depersonalize politics much more and create mini republics, create more epistemic room for hearing diverse perspectives, right? Having new vision of deliberative democracy, right? Because clearly the political crisis we're in so many parts of the world is also a crisis of untruthfulness, right? The truth to authoritarians and fascists just does not have a lot of value. And should we just accept that, or should we think about how this can be also countered, right? Because the kind of paradoxical problem that we're having right now is those people, politicians, authoritarians, that are openly spreading falsehoods and lies, and Trump just claiming that Tylenol, you shouldn't take Tylenol anymore, without any basis. Let me finish this for one second, and I want to hear your response. Even though the most untruthful politicians are often considered to be particularly truthful, accurate, and sincere. And that's a problem we kind of also have to understand. Why do liars in politics often appear to be particularly truthful? Right? So how can we criticize this paradox, for example? I just think that truthfulness is an interesting way to look at many of our forms right now. Right? Because also when fascists, for example, glorify the past and say they want to make something great again, right? They are in a certain sense untruthful. Right? So I just want to say that this is what we can criticize with Williams without, I think, having to go down the route of saying that justice is only about truthfulness. But But justice is clearly also about avoiding cruelty. Right? I agree with Shapar here. But the basis of cruelty in Shapar, the foundations of it, is also not particularly perspicacious, not also particularly clear. And I'm currently working on a paper with David Owen where we try to kind of analyze, for example, how cruelty is enabled and cultivates untruthfulness, and why that's just an interesting way to go about it. I don't have to kind of make a foundationalist claim that all injustice in the world is about being untruthful, but there are just interesting connections between political injustice, cruelty, and untruthfulness.
I would just say just one thing, now I'm going to say is that first, the right-wing, extreme right-wing politicians are deeply untruthful, but those who came before were very untruthful too. I mean, of course.
Yeah.
And the second, but related to this, maybe I'm going to say two things. The second one is that what worries me about that diagnosis about what's going on is that it places the cause of what's going on features that are almost psychological about politicians being untruthful. And it diverts the attention from the structural features of the way in which the economic and political systems are functioning, and that have very little to do with epistemic attitudes and with psychological attitudes, people being truthful or manipulative or liars, but that is the way in which the world is structurally organized in politics and the economics. And people who have offered very interesting diagnosis of fascism, like Harpolainen, for example, he focuses on the structural features, not on the psychology. And so that's what worries me about the diagnosis you're offering. Maybe you're right, and maybe very relevant, but it falls very short from offering a convincing diagnosis of what's happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not aspiring to kind of offer a full-fledged diagnosis of why we're in this mess, right? But I wouldn't disconnect structural questions, the way the economy is structured, for example, and the way it also creates a bunch of unnecessary suffering, from psychological features. One can clearly maybe diagnose a certain particular form of corruption, right, that is a result of the way our world is structured, because it limits our ability to live in the truth, right? For example, one could make an economic argument that there's that the workplace is unjust, right? And we need to kind of think about democratizing the economy. One reason for that is that people have to work so long hours, suffering in certain ways that make them not have the time to, engage democratically and meet others in a way that would actually be conducive to truthfulness, because they would be in contact with other perspectives, right? So here, like, the structural feature of our economy can, of course, produce certain problems of untruthfulness, I would say, right? That can be the case. So you can think about structures as a corruptive feature when it comes to psychology, right? I can I say something about the epistemic humility point? Because of course that's a critique one can obviously make of Williams that I didn't make in the talk. He speaks about the importance of epistemic humility, and then at the end he's himself not epistemically humble. And I think that's a good point, because, for instance, his irreversibility claim that I mentioned, that is not a particularly epistemically humble point. Right, because you say we've reached a certain state of effectiveness where we cannot go back from, right? And you also make a claim with regards to progressivists, saying that certain ideas just cannot be revived. How do we know which ideas of the past cannot be revived? And isn't that also too strong a claim? Because there are people who want to revive the idea of plutocracy, right? To respond to our democratic crisis. There are people like McCormick who want to revive the Machiavellian plebeian tribunal and all this. So here Williams is also not epistemically humble enough, because of course there are ideas from the past that are actually very useful to revive for progressive politics. That's just one thing I wanted to say about the epistemic humility.
Yes, thank you very much, Amadeus. I have like one broad and open question and two smaller points. So the open question would be, what about, or what is the gain of a relativism of distance imagined in space and not in time?
Good.
Because of course, this is the question that we have to answer
Yeah, very
now,
good.
right now.
That's
Yeah.
good.
And then the two small points were on two things that you write in your slides. The first one on the slide on moralistic mistakes, because you wrote that in traditional societies, people were not kind of aware that there were alternatives, possible alternatives, and thought that the EU way or their form of life was necessary. I'm not sure about this. So how can we just claim this? Because I mean, I'm dealing a little bit with Arabic philosophy of the 19th centuries, and there were so many alternatives. Even if the mainstream just thought, okay, I don't know, Salafist won, but it is. I don't think this history went this way, because if you take this to be true, then how can you explain change and cantos and so forth and so on? And then the other one was in the slide on epistemic humility, maybe just a terminological point, but it kind of catch my attention. You wrote that past cultures were under the spell of illusion, but that shouldn't lead to the conclusion that we have discovered moral truths. Now, from how you answered some questions before, I would say that, well, this shouldn't lead to the conclusion that we have discovered moral truths, but maybe we have discovered truth. So in an epistemic sense.
Yes.
So illusion, when you wrote under the spell of illusion, was in an epistemic sense, in which sense? Because
epistemic sense.
Okay.
Well, I mean, this is another controversial point in Williams writes that he does think we can reach a somewhat absolute conception in the scientific realm. Right, but I'm not a philosopher of science, and I think Putnam also pressed him on this, right? That his view of science is also deeply problematic. So that's another road one could go. But yeah, when he speaks about truths, he means them in the basically the variant sense of disenchantment, right? Like these processes and certain scientific discoveries, like the Copernican revolution. He means these kinds of truths he has in mind, right? And sorry, I'm beginning from the end to work myself up because I think your first question was the most challenging. So, of course, this is a claim by Williams. Like he believes that there were these assumptions of necessities, right? And maybe that is itself quite ahistorical perception, because there were always a bunch of alternatives. They were just suppressed by those who were in power, right? That's a very good point, right? But then there clearly were beliefs in necessity, right? And there were certain beliefs that were much more widespread. So this belief in necessary identities, that is like key in Williams, right? That has been very prevalent in the past, and it is still prevalent. You know, this idea that certain social groups are more prone to certain social positions, right? Like you can talk a lot about the feminist movement here as a change that try to get rid of these ideas of necessity. You know, that a woman has to be like this and has to do this, right? So you can clearly explain change, I think, by showing how certain ideas of necessity just lost hold. Right? And how certain material changes, also structural changes, led to us realizing that this is not necessary. You know? One can, for instance, tell a story about the invention of I don't know how to say it in English. How you type before you had computers.
The typewriter.
Typewriter. Well, how you type when you write it. Typewriter. Sure. Like for instance, Raleigh Yegi makes this point really nicely in her new book, Progress and Regression, where she says, for instance, the typewriter had, as an economic change, a huge influence on the emancipation of women, because they were introduced into the workforce by being typewriters, right? And that led them to other changes. So, I mean, basically, what Williams is making also is somewhat a Marxist point. You know, it's a failure to think that certain moral attitudes just won out. You know, and someone just had an argument Kant and Hume had arguments, and then people started to realize that Kant is actually right, and then practices change. The process is always much more complex. Practices have to change, and then the beliefs change. It's not the beliefs, true moral beliefs, like being the driving force of change, right? And that's still a very important point, right? Because it tells us something about how we should think about making progress, right, and abolishing capitalism injustice, right? And then your first point, what about the relativism of distance? Basically applied to space, right? That's a point that Mariana Fricka makes in a critique of Williams, right? Where she says there are clearly also outlooks in the world right now that we could not easily go over to, right? That are really incompatible, and we could not live by them, right? We could not just live by the way members of ISIS live. So does that mean we can be, we're right, we could be basically convinced of their ideology, yeah. But it does, for instance, there are still cannibalistic tribes in the world and all this, right? So there's still this problem of the relativism of distance, that is for sure. And I guess, okay, the only thing I will say here is that a really problematic feature of Williams's view is, which is related to the relativism of distance in the here and now, that now under modernity, we should all accept liberalism as the basic condition for existence. Right? That's just what we have to accept. A certain idea of basic human rights, toleration, representative democracy, this is just under modern conditions, the outlook we should adopt, and all other outlooks are false. Right? And that seems also to be, when you think about epistemic humility, just false. Right? And I would always say, what about socialism? Can socialism, as a critique of liberalism, present an alternative view here? Do you just rule that out? So Williams' connection of liberalism and modernity itself is also problematic as a measure to judge many different societies. Because how can we be sure that it is liberalism that is basic condition of legitimacy? And what do we mean by liberalism? But his point stands that it's important to understand liberalism as something that is not a triumph of moral understanding, but a doctrine that is actually quite recent, right? And people who too quickly claim that it's true really have trouble explaining why it arrived so late on Earth. That's a good point. I accept that point. But that doesn't have to lead us to the conclusion that modernity only allows liberalism as a condition of legitimacy.
That's it. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go back just as the response to Esteban, and I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a point that's already been made, but I want to insist on it because your response sounded very, very realist. So I still have a hard time just realism, just epistemicism, right? Because it seems like all the work has been done by ignorance and knowledge and what they don't know, what we don't know, what we don't know about what they know, blah blah blah. So So is that it? Is it just ontologically a realism of values and of facts, and then on top of it, a lot of contingent facts that make us know some things that others don't know, either in space distance or in time distance, and that explains why we can understand that other people don't know what they don't know, and that we know that they don't know that they know, and that is what is doing all the work of grounding tolerance. Is that it?
Yeah. When you say realism, do you mean moral realism?
Actually, both, because of what she already said. But yes, moral realism at least.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's definitely a realist about and the epistemic ground.
Yes,
scientific. He's a realist.
Yeah.
And that's maybe very controversial. I'm not going into this. Okay. but I know that Putnam says that as well. It's clearly this idea of absolute conception with regards to the scientific realm is questionable. Yes. And then his claim is we can never reach this absolute conception, which would be moral realism for me, in the realm of ethics.
We cannot reach.
We cannot reach this absolute conception because
but reach here only means we cannot know it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. He doesn't want to reject their moral truths. It's just he says something about how we can actually be sure that we've discovered things we can never get, because we'll always be. It's just basically an account of what it is to reflect in philosophy about what you're basically forced to do at the end of the day, right? And how you also having a quite misguided picture of what reflection entails and what needs to be done to convince someone of the view, right, and show that that is what we should accept right now. If you assume that there's more truth, right? But yes, but then still, he seems at the end of the day, moral realism is connected, of course, to an idea of objectivity. Conditions of when we know that that's an objective moral truth. And then I would say, Williams does not reject objectivity at the end of the day, and ethics and the limits of philosophy. He has a particular conception of what objectivity means, and he describes it as, not as a kind of rational intuitionism, that can get in touch with truth by intuition, but he thinks it's a convergence, something we would all converge on, and something that would grow from inside human life. That would be something objective. But what that at the end means, that we should discuss. But he says, if there's objectivity, it would have to grow from inside human life. Now we can think about what does it mean, and it connects to the internalism of reasons, right? Yeah, his historical conception of humanity and what it means to be human, and then all of a sudden we have a really interesting discussion about morality.
Yeah, that's pretty helpful. Thank you.
So I think it's like political realism goes astray if it's just an argument against morality in general, right? The discussion becomes much more interesting when it's about moralism as a distortion of what morality should actually mean to us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Thanks very much.
I have a very small question, but that perhaps is a misunderstanding. But first, I will say that you are right that the moral and epistemic humility are very important against the arrogance of some forms of universalism. But I don't think that the concept of truthness can replace other concepts like universality or justice. And my small question is, do you think that it's impossible that a criminal has true and justified beliefs, and at the same time his actions are horrible?
I believe so, and my task would be to show that Williams would have to say the same, right?
I don't.
I believe so, and Williams would, and I'm trying to argue that Williams would have to say the same, that a criminal, even though it's all consistent with his subjective motivation set, what he's doing, is still acting unjustly because there's some internal reason that he actually has as a human being that he's kind of disrespecting, that he would recognize if he reasoned soundly. But sometimes, acting criminally is not always. It's not always unjust, right? Under situations of injustice where you're forced to be criminal,
well, but
it can be just
unjust actions could be the same person can have clearly, I think, true and justified beliefs.
Yeah, and Williams would have to show on the basis of the sound deliberative route that there's still some mistake being made, if he wants to say that this kind of criminal act is in fact not justified. So we'd have to speak about in what sense there has not been a sound reflective process, and then Williams would have to say something about like the criminal did not really imagine what his actions would entail, for example. There was a lack of imagination. Like what this would actually lead to and what this would mean for his life, but also for the life of others. Right? He acted short-sightedly, he did not think things through. Right? The sound deliberative route means something like you are in possession of all relevant facts, you've imagined all possible scenarios. For instance, Williams would have had to say something like, there was another course of action that he could have chosen that would have been equally good, if not better. He was just not aware of it, and that's why he acted unjustly. Right? The sound deliberative route is key here, I suppose.
Sounds a little strange.
Sounds a little bit route, sounds strange.
Don't accept that a criminal could have true and justified beliefs.
He could. He could.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that he couldn't. No, sure. Criminal can have true and justified beliefs, right? But still, Williams is able to criticize certain forms of criminality on the basis of his internalism of reasons.
Yeah, he would say that he has a wrong desire, some sort of wrong motivation,
Yeah,
because the
okay.
motivational set hasn't been reflected enough or something like that.
And I guess especially in cases of criminality, that can often be the case.
But
Right.
the problem is how to judge wrong desires.
From a universal point of view.
There's maybe one small thing that I want to say at the end because I didn't mention it. If we have the time. Williams also made the curious and interesting point that there are, of course, certain conceptions of the past that are still with us. You know, certain ideas of justice that were prevalent in ancient Greece are still with us in certain forms. In particular, with regards to the role of luck, that luck should not determine the chances you have in your life. And obviously, we have contemporary views of justice that are called luck egalitarians, right? So who say that your chances in life, your chances to flourish, should not depend on luck, but on genuine choices. And Williams could say, well, if this view is still with us and has been with us for 2 millennia, isn't that maybe also an indication that there's some truth in it, right? And Cohen, J. Cohen, who was with Williams for a long time at All Souls College, right? At All Souls. He did use this and said against Williams, well, so the Greeks had views of justice that would have made them able to criticize the great slaves. Right? And of course, their belief that it was naturally necessary to the slaves, put it beyond the realm of justice. But there was an idea of justice that could kind of explain what is in general wrong with slavery. Right? And Cohen uses this and says, like, well, okay, so the basic principle, the basic idea of what makes slavery as a form of subordination unjust back then and today are still the same. So maybe we should believe that that's true. That's just how do you say, like water on my mills? Because I want to criticize Williams on that front and say, like, look, you do seem to believe that there's some truth in justice. Right? And maybe the view that justice is about truthfulness is not entirely convincing, but maybe then the view of luck egalitarians is quite convincing, right? So what you cannot really answer with Williams well, and I guess I haven't done a particularly good job to defend truthfulness as one of the prime virtues of justice, is to ask, like, okay, in all the different conceptions of justice we now have that are also rooted in the past, how can we make a decision between them, right? And Williams had made a decision. He said, like, liberalism, right? But maybe it doesn't have to be liberalism, it can also be socialism. But that's just something I wanted to add. But thank you very much. I mean, this has been challenging. It's always difficult to present ideas you were yourself not very certain about. Thank you for pushing me. Thank you for coming. Unless there's still a question. No. Okay.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.